Okay, so this is a video to get you up and running in the basic rendering ideas, basic rendering concepts inside of Revit. So right now I've been working with my studio class and my 225 class, which is the Introduction to Computers class, on leveraging Revit to build some pattern models of geometric shapes, and then we're looking at how those can turn into buildings or ideas of buildings. And so this is one of those projects that I'm working with that I've been using on a couple of videos. So we're going to leverage this as something that we're going to composite, very roughly composite, mind you, into a background template in Revit. So let's look at the basics of how we would set that up and get it ready to run. Okay, so first of all, in my site view, I need to establish a camera from the direction that I want to create my rendering from. And I have this background plate inside of Photoshop that's something like this. Now this is captured from Street View, which is definitely not ideal at all. The camera's a little bit high. You can see I'm looking down on top of a car. It does some weird things as well in terms of when the Google Street View process seams things together. I have sort of floating lines and some weird stuff like that. But this is going to be good enough for the purposes of this video. And I'm going to be kind of slopping it together anyway. We're going to put that geometry right here on this site. Again, all of it very rough, just enough to get you the idea of how to do this in sort of a more masterful way, hopefully. Okay, so let's dive back into Revit. So I'm going to try and emulate roughly this camera location. Again, ideally speaking, I would actually have some measurements and I would know the angle, the type of camera I was shooting with. Again, the Street View camera is a little bit wider of an angle than a standard camera. So this is going to be one of those close enough kind of moments here that we're going to work with. So camera was right around here. So I left clicking to place the camera. I'm going to left click again to select where the camera is looking. And I want to look sort of across this object. Now, it's really important to note, wherever I place this, the view is going to stop. So if I click right here in the middle of my 3D view, or the middle of my geometry, I'm actually going to see all of the geometry. It's going to cut or crop the end of that view off. So let's get rid of that. It's certainly something that I can fix later, but something that's kind of nice to get right the first time. So again, I'm going to click right about in this location. I'm going to extend what I'm looking at, or the direction I'm looking to, all the way across. Next, I'm going to go ahead and crop my view just a little bit using the boundary from my 3D view. I also typically like to remind people this is a virtual camera. Treat it no differently than you would a real camera. Think about rules of thirds. Think about lining things up. Think about how you want to establish a dynamic view across your geometry. Okay, so I can stretch this thing out and I can slide it out. Just remember, you are modifying perspective in some odd ways. Like if I stretch this way out here, the geometry in front of me isn't going to be modified, but if I did have objects over here, I'm going to start doing some weird things in terms of how the perspective looks. So I generally like to keep things fairly close, but I always take the rendering out of that sort of 4:3 old school TV aspect ratio, and I typically like to get something more of a landscape aspect ratio with most of the rendering work that I do. So let's go ahead and set this up as a higher resolution rendering next. So again, with this outside border selected, I need to go to size crop. And size crop is going to give me the dimensions, the current dimensions of my rendering for the field of view. But I also might need to increase the width and height to get a higher resolution image. And to do that, I need to change from field of view. This is going to modify the size of this bounding box to a scale or locked proportions. So I want to change this width. I want an 18-inch wide rendering. It's automatically going to update the height for me. When I say OK, essentially it looks like things get larger. It's actually the exact same frame, but this is going to render out an 18-inch wide image for me rather than a much smaller 6-inch image, which I had previously. So that done, and notice, let's look at that one more time. I'm not using field of view. If I change field of view, if I change that down to 12 inches, it's changing the size of the box. What I want to change on size crop is this scale locked proportions button to change the size of the image that I'm rendering. Okay, really important thing to note. So let's hit cancel right there. I'm going to keep the previous setting that I had. So next I'm going to go down to the teapot with a light bulb. This is my rendering dialog box. I'm ready to go to a medium quality rendering. I'm not going to jump it all the way up to high, but I want something a little bit better than the draft for this video. Generally speaking, high or medium are going to be acceptable for most of the work you're going to do. I want to set my resolution. So screen is going to give me the resolution of the monitor. I actually want to set my resolution to 300 dpi so that I have something that I can work with my background template inside of Photoshop. I have that currently set to a 300 dpi image, 18 inches wide. Next, I am working with an actual location, and I'm not sure the time of day on this. The shadows are casting a little bit to the west, so I'm going to guess this is about 11 a.m. in Kansas City, Missouri. So let's go ahead and set that sun setting up. Not sure the time of year either, so we're just going to make our very best guess. So I'm going to go ahead and on my lighting setting, I'm going to go to still. My location, I'm going to use the project city list. I'm going to scroll down and select Kansas City. I'm not going to worry about getting quite to the exact location, 19th and Main, of this site. We're just going to go ahead and work with that. That's going to be close enough in terms of my latitude and longitude. So I'll say OK to that. I'll go ahead and use today's date, 11 a.m. as a time, and I'm going to say OK and disable updater. So I have that set up as my shadows, so that shadows are casting in the same direction. It's one of the first things that's going to wreck a rendering and push things right into the uncanny valley is if shadows are going in multiple directions. We always want to make sure that we're doing our best to match those things up, both with our initial rendering and any entourage that we use, which will be here in the next step that we're going to do. So I'm going to go ahead and click render. And this should only take a couple of seconds to render out. There's not a lot happening with the geometry here. And this is going to be time to talk about sort of a new thing with the rendering system inside of Revit. At least it was new to me in 2017. And that is the background. So right now I'm rendering with background view clouds. And any way that I export this, it's going to give me that background with the clouds, which is great if I'm not going to do much with this rendering. If I already have everything modeled in place and there's not a lot of additional work that I want to do, this as a rendering would be just fine for me. But I actually want to take this geometry and put it into another image. So to adjust that, I'm going to go ahead and change my background style to transparent. So notice there are a few additional options: very cloudy, color, image, etc. I want to render this out so I can composite this this geometry into another image as a transparent background. So let's go ahead and render that out one more time. So take even less time. And you can see I get this checkerboard pattern. The checkerboard pattern is sort of your ubiquitous signal in all of 3D programs and 2D image editing programs. It's your indication that nothing is there. That is a transparent object or a transparent surface, which is what I want. So I can slide this geometry directly into Photoshop in that background plate. So with this, I'm going to go ahead and hit export, and we're going to export this as a .png file. Either the PNG or TIFF will work. So let's just call this 19th Street View and save. And let's go into Photoshop. So in Photoshop, file open. Hi Osteen, we don't want you. We want 22517. Nineteenth Street View, open. So from this location, all that I need to do is select all, edit, copy. Here's my background template, edit, paste. that is going to give me a new layer over the top of my background layer. So you can see that right there. So I need to work a little bit with the scale, quite obviously. I really don't want it in the street. If I move this back, it's going to be oversized. But some of the other things are working out okay for me. So I'm just going to use a really simple technique here. Edit, transform, scale. Let's just pull that geometry down so that it's sitting on this open parking lot a little bit better. Something about like that. So you can see there are a few things that are working okay right off the bat. The shadows are definitely casting roughly in the right direction. I don't have shadows on the ground for this object, so that's something that we could work on and begin thinking about ways to add in, not for this video. One of the other things though is I do have some foreground background things happening. So I've got like this light pole right here that is clearly in front of my object. So there are a few things right away that I might want to go in and clean up. And to do those, it's a pretty simple process. The first thing, I don't want to lose my original layer. So I'm going to copy it. So I'm just going to drag that down and make a duplicate of it. Layer 2 copy. And I'm going to keep that layer 2 copy, but I'm going to turn it off. This gives me the opportunity, if I mess up just completely, I can always roll back into exactly what was there. Okay, I'm going to be a slop artist about this as well, but essentially my next task is to come in and start deleting some of the things that I don't want in my rendering. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to turn my opacity down just a little bit. I want to be able to see through my objects, and I'm going to use the polygonal lasso. I'm just going to set up really quickly right along the edges of this pole. Just like that. And then I can simply come in with my eraser and I can be really quick about erasing this. It's going to give me a nice hard edge to erase right across so that my foreground elements and my background elements are actually beginning to work correctly, because clearly that pole is in front of the rest of my geometry. Select, deselect, and I can do some of those things without the polygonal lasso. You know, I can certainly come in and begin erasing some of those things out for smaller items like that newspaper or trash or whatever that thing is right there. I can do that without it, but typically I'll take most of the time I'll take my time and do something really quick with the polygonal lasso, so that way I can work through those items really quickly. So you can see now I've got that sort of in front of the building, or in front of this geometry. Other things that I would want to do, you know, the car looks really weird. I'd probably erase some of these items out, and continue to work the quality of these two images together. So the next thing that often comes up is Entourage, working in Entourage into these images. So one of my new favorite websites is called Mr. Cutout, which is absolutely excellent. Lots and lots of different things to choose from in terms of Entourage, and free. So free is good. So from Mr. Cutout, grab these two dudes with the backpacks. Same trick, they're already cut out. You know, I can see the background here, so a lot of work has already been done for me. Select all, edit, copy, into my composite image, edit, paste, and they're huge. Well, not necessarily huge, because again, remember, when we're working with compositing, what really matters are not the actual size of the entourage, it's where they're placed. So right now we have two giants walking down 19th Street. But if I were to bring their eye height right in line approximately with the horizon line, and let's drag down a guide to get that horizon line in so we can start looking at the eye height. We can see scale-wise they work out great in that location. Okay, so let's leave that set of entourage there for right now, and let's duplicate, and let's move both of them over. So again, I want to keep the eyes roughly on this horizon line, or it's actually just a shave above the horizon line. So by doing that, I can now come in and say Edit, Transform, Scale. Let's drop these down. Place them on the sidewalk here. And again, as long as the eyes kind of line up, the scale of that entourage is going to look correct. But there's a few things that scale-wise aren't happening right here as well. Well, actually, they do look a little bit too tall. The reason why, if you think about this image, this is over the top of the car. This is probably camera angle looking down. I would say this is a camera that's more about 8 feet. Well, not quite 8 feet. Probably 6, 8, maybe 7 feet tall, because it's right in line with this awning. And if you have seen one of the Street View cars, they're always mounted sort of up high. So let's shrink them down just a little bit more. At this point, I'm going to have to kind of just use my instinct and eye to get them about right. That looks a lot better. Place them right over here. So the next thing, in terms of working with Entourage, there's a few things that are still a little bit off. The first, they're floating. They're not casting any shadows. So let's do that, and then let's also turn them into something that is simply going to allow us to see them as scale figures without the detail, because again, these are quite a bit different than both the rendering quality and the background template quality. So a lot of times you'll see sort of these ghosty entourage figures simply there to give you a sense of scale. So let's go through both options first. So let's name this entourage distance. I'm going to make a copy. So I'm going to take my entourage distance layer. I want to slide it underneath entourage distance. Okay. I'm going to go to Image, Adjust, Brightness, Contrast, and I'm going to turn on Use Legacy. I'm going to slide the brightness down. I'm going to slide the contrast down and say OK. And I get that. Okay, so let's undo that really quickly because I want to turn this layer off. So I have these two layers matched, and this one's underneath. Let's do that one more time so we can actually see what happens with this layer turned off. So I'm going to go Image, Adjust, Brightness, Contrast, Use Legacy. I'm going to turn the contrast down. It's going to turn them gray. I'm going to turn the brightness down. That turns them black. Okay, let's go someplace right around. Let's do more of a medium gray, something like that. And say OK. Now a lot of times that is sort of exactly the quality that I'm looking for more of a ghosty kind of background, especially when I come in and given just a little bit of transparency for that layer. But in this particular case, what I'm wanting to do is build a shadow. So let's go back to brightness contrast, drop the brightness down just a little bit. So what I'm looking at is the quality of this shadow right here. I'm going to turn my initial layer on, so we're back in color, but I'm still working with this copy. I'm going to go Edit, Transform, Distort, and I'm simply going to squish them this way to build the shadows at the same angle as the shadows that are currently being cast. So just like that. So from here, I need to give that a little bit of additional transparency. So I'm going to use my opacity, transparency opacity slider. About like that. And they need just a little bit of blur. Typically, shadows are a little bit softer. And that's simply from ambient light. So I'm going to use the Gaussian blur filter, radius of about 1. So not a lot of blur, but just enough. So you can see that's already matching that shadow quality of some of the existing shadows. Not great, but good enough for a tutorial. And then again, I would want to come back and erase out what the shadows are in front of and behind. So really, really simple way to do that. So let's go back and let's go one more time and let's say, well, we really don't want the entourage to be this sort of photoreal. That's not something we're going for. I would simply come in and say Mode, Adjustment, or Image Adjustment, Brightness, Contrast, and I can use that same trick again to kind of pull the contrast out and have more of the ghosty ghost figures. So I get that sense of scale. I still want them casting a shadow. but I can start to see how that works overall in the background image. So that basically takes us from Revit into Photoshop, setting up a basic perspective, beginning to see how things would fit into a background plate or a background template, um, to build up some basic compositing, and the idea of starting to put in some basic entourage inside of this for a final rendering.